All right, everyone. It is 6:07 p.m. Central Time, Wednesday, October 11th. This is session 2 of the Intro to Coding Live for JavaScript for Code Platoon. We're going to go ahead and do a quick review of conditional logic. This is where we left off on Monday evening. We're going to review conditional logic. We're going to talk about writing some loops, which we refer to as iteration. And then talk a little bit more about built-in methods, how to solve problems. There's only a handful of slides for session 2, and a lot of that we've already covered because part of it is an introduction to the replet, which we started using on Monday. All right, so as we talked about here, with conditional logic, this is how we control which way the computer goes through your program. So this is allowing the computer to evaluate something and then make a conditional choice based on if it evaluates to true or false. Also allows us to select different outcome depending on user input or the result of a computation. All right, and the most basic form of this is the if statement. All right, and so let's go ahead and pull up our notes, and we can say, let A equal 7, or we did numbers last time, so we could do something like this. So we could say yes, right? And so now we could do something along the lines, if A triple equals yes, then we'll return or console.log user answered yes. All right, and because A is set to yes right now, when I run this, the user answered yes. Now, if I change this to anything besides yes, right, I get nothing because I have no else statement. All right, and so I could do something like this. Right, the user did not answer yes, and this could be anything. Now I could also do, so this is now an if-else statement. And if I wanted to change this into an else if statement, where I wanted to have specific outcomes for other words, like no, then what we could do is add an else if here. Right, and so now, whoops, I did not put that in there as a string. Right, the user answered no, and then if they put anything in there besides yes or no, we would say the user did not answer correctly, right? And so now, and we could also do something like this. So we could say else if A triple equals maybe, right? Then we could say something like console.log user and make, whoops, can't make up their mind, right? Take this out of here, else right, so the user did not answer correctly, change this to a maybe. All right, the user can't make up their mind. All right, so we can keep adding additional else if statements in here. We could also, and I don't necessarily recommend this, like it can get confusing and it can get messy pretty quick, but we can nest if statements, right? So we could then say something like, but B equal, I really meant yes, right? And we could change this to yes. And then we could say if B equals I really meant yes, then you could say the user answered yes, and they really mean it. Right? Otherwise, we could just have if else here and then say user and they really mean it. Right? If they don't put anything in here, it's going to be false in that nested one. The user answered yes, and they don't mean it. Right? So we can continue to nest our if statements to make our logic more complex. Right? And this is mostly what software is, right? Is basically asking for input either from the system directly or from a user, and then asking, depending on the input that we're given, asking the computer to make different decisions based on that input. And this is how we give it the choices that it can make. All right. Has anyone in the class heard of a ternary operator before?
Yes, in Python.
Okay, I heard someone say yes. And it looks like this autocomplete is getting out of control with the this here. So a ternary operator, and I'll take advantage of this, right? We don't want to call it let A and B. Get rid of this, right? And so we'll just call this answer, and we'll say answer. And we'll take this out of here. All right, so let me just comment this out here for right now. So a ternary operator is the same thing as a if-else statement. It is just shorthand. We get rid of the if and the else. Okay, so same thing here, right? If we look up here, my if statement is if A is equal to yes. So if answer is strictly equal to yes, then we give it a question mark. And then this is the true outcome, and this is the false outcome. So this is the if, this is the else. So if we run this, I would expect to see the user answered yes. Oops, let's see here. Why did we not? Okay, sorry, it was just taking a while for it to run. So this is the same thing as doing if answer triple equals yes. Right, so this does the exact same thing as this. All right, this is just doing it on one line and not having all the wrappers of the if and the else. Now, this is just an if else statement every time, so there's no if like else if or anything like that. Again, with ternaries, you can nest them. So on one side of the colon here, I can put another ternary, but again, that gets very hard to read very quickly. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that. But these are appropriate, they're good to go. If you use them in your code, more power to you. You can also just use the standard if-else statement if you feel more comfortable with that. But you will see both of these moving forward. All right, and so that's the review of the conditional logic. So let's hop into iteration. So iteration is, and actually I apologize. Before I move into iteration, any questions on the review of the if-else statements or what a ternary operator is? No one? Okay, so we'll get into loops. All right, so loops can execute a block of code a number of times. As long as the condition is true, the block of code will continue to execute. When the condition becomes false, the code after the end of the loop will be executed. All right, so this is a while loop. So let's go ahead and build a while loop here and we'll take a look at it. All right, so with a while loop, with any loop, we need to make sure that we are continuing to move through our loop and move towards an end state of our loop. Because if we do not, we will write what's called an infinite loop and it will never stop. All right, so if I say while true, console.log Charles. All right, so when I hit run here, this is just going to start scrolling Charles, right? And it's never going to stop until my replit runs out of virtual memory. And then it's going to crash and tell me that I have a stack overflow and I used up all my memory and there's something wrong with my program. Right, so if I hit stop, right, so exit status -1, that means that there was something going on that was forced. All right, so what I need to do is make sure that my loop is always moving towards an end state, right, where it is no longer true. And so we could do something like this. So we could say let count equal 0, and we can say count less than 10. And if I run this again, I'm in an infinite loop, right? Because I'm not doing anything with count. It's always 0 every time it goes back and checks that. So what I need to do is something like this. So I need to do count plus equals 1, right? Or the longhand way of doing that is count as equal to count plus 1, right? And so now it stops counting. So count is 0, and then count is equal to 0 plus 1. So count is 1. The next time through, so on and so forth. And then it basically, once count hits 10, it says that 10 is no longer less than 10. And this resolves as false. And then we stop looping through this coding. All right. And this is the longhand way of doing this. I can also do it like this. So I can do count plus equals 1. All right. And then the, do I have drawing on for everyone? Okay. So I think oh, where did the individual go? I saw the name flash, who was drawing on the screen. So if you could delete that when you get a chance, because it doesn't seem to be letting me do it. We've got a green line drawn on the screen here. I think it was Maki. Okay, so you figure out how to delete the line that you drew over there. I will keep going. Okay, and so this is the shorthand way of doing this, and now I'm drawing on the screen. Awesome. All right, there we go. Clear all drawings. There we go. We cleared all drawings. Cool. So again, this is the shorthand version of doing it, right? And we are counting by one. We could count by threes if we want to, right? And then we see my name less times because it goes 0, 3, 6, 9. And then on the next one would be 12. That would no longer be true. We punch out. You can also, if you are incrementing or decrementing by one, you can also do count plus plus or count minus minus. And that is shorthand for +1 or -1, right? So if I do this, there's my name. What we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. All right. And so those are all different ways that you can increment and decrement while we're doing our looping. So we could say let count equal 0, and then we could say count plus equals count plus 1. We could say count plus equals 1, or we could say count plus plus, right? All ways to increment or decrement in JS, right? And because so the same things hold true for minus in here, right? So we could do that. We could do minus equals, and we can do minus minus. All right, and so that is a while loop, and this is some pretty basic code right here. But you can put any code that you want to inside of your loop. All right, and the next type of loop that we're going to talk about is a for loop. And this is very similar to a while loop for the most part. There are a couple of times where you would use a while loop instead of a for loop. But for looping or a for loop is when you're going to be counting every time. A while loop, we can use this to count like we are here and we're incrementing, but we could also use it like, let's say if we wrote a simple terminal game like tic-tac-toe, right? And we could say, does user want to play, right? And then in here we could put code for tic-tac-toe, and then we can declare our variable up here, let does user want to play, and we can make that equal to true. And then at the end of each game, ask user, do they want to play another game? If yes, does user want to play equals true, else equals false, right? And so now this will continue to loop over and over and over again an infinite amount of times until the user actually gives us feedback saying, I do not want to play anymore, right? Then we set the variable, does user want to play equals to false. We go back up to the top of the loop. This says false. Then we could put some code here that is, say, console.log, thanks for playing, right? And so when we do this, we always read code from top to bottom. We would enter our loop. The starts off as true. They've started the game. They're playing, they're playing, they're playing. We set this to false. We come up here, this is false. We skip over all of the code to play the game, and we come down here and we console.log a message that says, thanks for playing the game. And that's more of a unique case for a while loop. Like a for loop would be if you only have a limited number of turns, and so you force them to stop playing the game after 5 rounds or 10 rounds. And so a for loop, when you're counting, so when you're incrementing or decrementing, to me, it's a little bit easier because it basically does the same thing as a while loop, but it takes this and this and it puts it all into the top line, because it's very easy to write your while loop when you're getting used to writing them and forget to increment your code, and then you've created an infinite loop. But when we do a for loop, so we can say for let I, which I stands for increment, it equals 0. So we're going to start counting at 0. While I is less than 10, I plus plus, right? Which means that we're counting by 1. And we can do the same thing in here. So we can say console.log for loop, right? And when we run this, let's go ahead and comment this out here real quick. Right, there's our for loop 10 times again, right? And instead of having a separate count, having to increment the count, we are then actually, it's all built in right to the top. And we could do something like this. So we could do I plus for loop, where then we'll put a space in there, right? 0, 1. So remember, we always start counting at 0. So we're at 9. If we wanted to start counting at 1, we could change I to 1, and then we would say less than or equal to 10, so that we get that 10th one on the top. Right now we're counting from 1 to 10. Now we can also count down, right? So we can do something like this, where we say we could say I is equal to 10 while I is greater than 0, and we want to say I minus minus, right? And so now we're counting down from 10 to 1, right? So you can see this is our first loop. And there's our second loop counting back down. I'm not sure what you're asking for there. All right, can you guys not see the replet? Okay, so I'm not sure if you've got something going on your screen, but it looks like most of the people can see the replet. Here, let me make it, I'll bump it up a size here. Is that a little easier for everyone to read? Cool. All right, so that's a for loop. And so again, for loops and while loops are pretty similar, with the exception that if you were doing something where you weren't counting and you were dependent upon a specific state for a prolonged period of time, or until a user gives you some sort of input to interact with, then maybe a while loop would be the better choice. All right. We also have a for in loop and a for of loop, and I always get these confused, and you'll see me through the rest of these slides. I'll always be going back to these two to remember the syntax for them. But a for in loop is specifically for objects, and excuse me, a for of loop is specifically for an array. And a lot of people, when they're working with an array, will just write a for loop. And let me show you what that looks like. So I could say let cat names equal Todd, Mo, Nugget, Nino, right? And so remember, when we want to look at one of these, just the element in there, we are going to address the name of the array, and then we're going to give it the index position of what we want to see. So comment these out. right? So at the 0 index, we get top. So remember 0, 1, 2, 3. Even though we stopped counting at 3, there's 4 elements in here. This array has a length of 4, right? But if I put 4 in here, I will get undefined because the thing at the 4th index position, there's nothing there, so it's just undefined. No value has been assigned there yet. All right. Now, when we loop, when we do a for loop, we were taking a look here, so we can say for let I equal 0, I less than cat names dot length, which we know is 4, and then we'll say I plus plus. All right, and so now if we console.log,
You said fort instead of 4.
I'm sorry, what's that?
You typed fort in line 57.
Oh, yes, thank you. I see it now. So console.log cat names. If I do that, what's going to happen, because I'm not giving it an index position, it's just going to give me the index or the whole array 4 times, right? And now I have something that I can use as an index position, right? So we're starting at 0. If I hard code the value 0 here, right, I just get the 0 index 4 times. But now if I give it an I, the first time we loop through it's 0, and then we add 1 to it. The second time we loop through it's 1, and so on until we get, as long as it's less than the length of this array, which is 4. So we would go 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. And then on the 4th one, we would break out of our loop, right? So there's Todd, Mo, Nugget, and Nino. And then we've broken out of our loop. Now, with that, you can write a for of array, right? And so we can say something like this. So we could say for name of cat names, console.log name. Go ahead and comment this out. There's Todd, Mo, Nugget, Nino. Now, with this, you are going to go through every element in this array. All right. So this is useful when you need to go through every element in the array. This is a lot less writing. You don't have to worry about adding the bracket notation, all the incrementing, decrementing, everything like that. However, you do have a little less control. So let's say if you wanted to stop, you only wanted the first 2 names on the list, right? So I could change this so that I could say, less than cat names dot length minus 2, right? And now I'm only going to get Todd and Mo, so I get Todd, Mo, and then we kick off again. So you have a little bit more control with this, but this is a little bit less code. And if you need to go through everything in that array, this is a good way to do it. All right, and now same thing for objects. So we could say let object equal, we'll just call it object 1, and we'll say first Charles, last Kubiak, and we'll say, sure, we'll take the auto recommendation here. What is it giving me next? Is cool, is true. All right, thank you, Replit. All right, and so now this is when we're trying to go through all of the key value pairs. So remember, this is a key, this is a value. We can use a for in. And so we can declare and this is, we're calling it key here in the example, but like we can call it whatever we want to. All right, and so we could say for let key in object 1, right? And then we could console.log key. And when we do that, we're just going to see all of the keys. Sorry. comment those out, right? So first, last, age is cool. And if you want to see the values, you actually have to use the key as a key, right? So we can say object one, bracket notation key. Right, and so there's the value. So I could do something like this. Oops. Right, and there's all my key value pairs. And so this is a for in loop that we use for objects. This is a for of loop that we use for arrays. Anything on the 4 different types of loops that I just covered?
What about the do while loop?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
What about the do while loops? I think it is
Oh, yeah, the do while loops. That is something that you can do in JavaScript. It's not something that I teach. Because basically you don't need to know it to be able to pass the application to get into Code Platoon. So in JavaScript, right? So there is a syntax of do while, right? And it's basically just another way to do a while loop. All right, and so I don't like basically the while loop would look like if we were to take this example. Right, and so this is basically the same thing. And it's just you're doing it with one less thing to worry about the do in there. There is also, and we'll talk about this with built-ins, and again, I don't go too far into them in class, but there are built-in methods for looping as well, dot map and dot for each. And what I strongly recommend to everyone in the class is if you are struggling with a while loop or a for loop, and get good at those 2 loops. Don't even worry about like the for in and the for of. Definitely don't worry about the built-ins for each or dot map, because there's some extra wrinkles with those. There's a lot less code writing involved. Like you don't have to write out the for and the let and all of this, but it takes away how to construct a loop properly, right? It abstracts that away from you. And if you're not comfortable identifying when you should be using a for and or a while loop to solve the problem, jumping into dot map and dot for each is not going to help you speed up. It's going to slow you down, and it's going to be even more confusing. So I recommend avoiding them until you're comfortable with writing for loops and while loops and understanding when and where you need to use them. Then you can start using for each and dot map and diving more into those where like they'll speed up your coding. But you have to be able to balance what your for loop is doing inside your head without seeing it written out on the screen. And that's why I don't teach those in the very intro class. All right, any other questions about looping before we move into the next part? And I do, okay, so Alexander, I do see the question about the $sign. All right, so remember when we have a string, right? So we could say, oh boy, what name equal Charles, right? This is a string inside single quotes. Date equal Wednesday, October 11th, 2023. Oops, I meant to do that in doubles. Right, so these are two numbers. And if I do backticks, right? So now I am inside. All right. And what that means is everything in between the backticks gets treated just like a string, right? So if I put age and year and I run this, oops, sorry, I gotta do that. And I've got to console.log example. Right? I just get age and year. But if I take this and I wrap it in curly braces and I precede it with a $sign, notice how it goes from this tan color to white. Now it is referencing the variable age, and it is going to substitute in that variable for the value that is stored in the variable. All right, so now I've got 29 in year, and I can do something like this, put the $sign in. All right, so now I've got normal string here, but I'm referencing back to different variables. Right, I will be 29 years old at the end of 2023. So if I get rid of those $signs, so even if I have the curly braces, if I just get rid of the $sign, I'll just see the word age in the curly braces. All right, and you may see me screw up once in a while. In Ruby, which is what I work in most of the time during the day, a string literal is done with a hash. It's a $sign in JavaScript. So if you see me do that, I'll go back and clean it up eventually. All right. So that is that one. Any other questions before we move on to the next section, which is built-in methods? Okay. So built-in methods, there are common actions that we perform on specific data types, and most languages have built-in methods or functions that allow us to perform these actions. All right, and so this is a built-in on a, on a string. This is a built-in on an array. This is a built-in on a number, right? This is a floating number. So an integer is a whole number. In JavaScript, any number with a decimal is called a float or a floating number, but it is still a number, right? And we can run the toFixed, and we can basically fix how many decimal places are available. Now, for any of you that have already been doing any studying on your own, there's bajillions of different resources out there for learning JavaScript. Some of them are high quality, some of them are not the greatest. MDN, which is the Mozilla Developer Network, so Mozilla is the company that basically puts Firefox out there. They basically maintain the source of truth for JavaScript. All right, so if it's in here, it's correct. And so what I would say is while you're searching for answers, right, and a big part of learning to code is how to search for the correct answers, is I usually recommend that you append MDN to the search, right? So like I can do to fixed, right, JS, and MDN is going to show up there at the top, but you get the W3 school, tech on the net, educative, geek for geeks, right? All of these are probably perfectly fine sources, but this is the one that's 100% going to be up to date every single time, right? Like this is the source of truth. These guys maintain the language or help maintain the language. So, and to fixed is a common one. So it showed up at the top. Sometimes you'll search for something and MDN won't be at the top. So I usually just say like to fixed, and MDN, whatever, and then you're guaranteed to get it up here at the top. All right. Now, to fixed was the one that was given for number. And as you can see, like there's quite a few here. These are all the built-in methods for number, right? And I can do the same thing. So I can do string, right? And let's take a look at string here, right? And so these are all the built-in methods for string. If you see this over here, deprecated, so you see the little red trash can, that means that it's not being actively used anymore. This feature is no longer recommended, though some browsers may still support it. And then if you scroll down through here, it'll tell you if you have browser compatibility. Like it'll tell you, I mean, for the most part, we're using Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, and there's going to be other ones out here, right? And it will tell you if the built-in function that you're writing will actually work inside that browser, because on all of these websites, these web applications, JavaScript is being executed behind the scenes. Remember, we talked about this when we go to Amazon. That site isn't just HTML and CSS. It is loaded with JavaScript, and it is executing all sorts of code in the background that you're not seeing on the surface. And every now and then there'll be some experimentals. So the green numbers are the version, right? Right, one released 2008. So basically every version of Chrome since it was released in 2008 has full support for this feature. And for almost all of these, you will see it. It's only when there is a update to the language, like a major update to the language, where they roll out some new, or maybe like an experimental one that's like in beta, and it'll tell you like, hey, it'll work in Chrome, but it won't work in Edge, right? And I'm sure if I dig enough in here, I could probably find some where it does or doesn't work with different sets of browsers. I don't know one off the top of my head, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time digging through these. But I'll also tell you, like, some of these, I have no idea what they do. I've never used them before, right? And it's like, and that doesn't mean that you won't end up using them, but like is well formed, I'm guessing has something to do, yeah, any loan surrogates. I have no idea what I would use this for. My guess is some like dealing with a web query of some sort, like an API query, or the response from it. But I've never had to use this before, you know, right? Or ill-formed. And so like we won't use it, but I've absolutely used at dot includes, index of, from char code, a bunch of different things here, pad and pad start, match all these different things. Like there are some that you'll use all the time. And again, there's built-ins for array, right? So array has tons of built-in methods on it that do all sorts of basic things that instead of having to write code for it over and over again to do these things, it's already built into the language. Someone determined that it's useful enough and that we're just going to build it in the language so that you can call this on the array class. So anything that's an array, you can call last index of, you can call join, index of, includes, right? All of these different things. But like I said, I've never used from async on array before, or from, in 4 or 5 years now of writing code. Doesn't mean that it's not valid, but some of these you will use much more than others. And then lastly, we do have object as well. We'll have built-in methods, right? So assign, create, define properties, entries, right, get own property. And so like there's quite a few built-in methods for object as well. And objects, it's a little trickier, where you see this one with prototype, you would write on the object that you are, like your specific object, but when you don't have a prototype in there, you actually write it on the class object. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get to those. All right, so common built-in methods, we just covered these: strings, numbers, arrays, objects, right? And again, I don't, with this stuff, like the very early stuff, we don't dive into each of them, but coming up on these successive nights, like session 3, session 4, session 5, we will dive into built-in methods on each of these different data types individually. All right. Any questions on built-in methods before I move to the next section here? All right, so we've got problem solving. So how to think like a programmer. Understand what the problem is asking you to do, how many inputs are required, what data types are the inputs that are required, what's the expected output, what's the data type of the expected output. Give examples of the inputs and expected output. Do I need any other variables? So I've got this one highlighted. Break down the problem into smaller problems. We talked about this on the first night, right? Like we've got a big problem that we don't understand. Let's start looking for the seams in the problem where we can start pulling it apart into smaller problems that we do understand, right? Like if you're brand new to this and I give you a problem that requires you to write an if-else statement, like you should be able, like, to, with enough time, walk through that and solve that. If I give you one that requires a loop, right, and we've gone over how to write a loop now, you may struggle with it for a while, but like you should be able to get it. But if I hand you a problem right off the bat that requires you to write 2 loops and each loop has its own specific conditional logic inside of it, like at that point, I would expect that people would throw their hands in the air and quit and be like, this isn't for me, right? Because that is a bigger, complicated problem. So what we do as we start working through these challenges is the first challenges are only going to have one core thing to solve in them. But then we're going to start giving challenges where you have to tack 2 or 3 of these things together. And when we start to level up in the difficulty, if you have a problem where you have to write 2 separate loops and have a conditional statement inside of each of those, instead of looking at it as, oh no, I need 2 loops and 2 conditional statements, it is, okay, now that I know that I need 2 loops and 2 conditional statements, what does my first loop look like? Okay, what does my conditional statement inside of that loop look like? Let's get that code working and giving me the output that I expect to see before I start moving into the next loop. Because if you have 2 half-written loops and 2 half-written conditional statements, you're never going to fight your way out of that situation, right? But as long as we can get one part of the problem working, we can then move to the next part. And if the next part isn't working for us, we always have a save point in our code that we can go back to where we know everything was right in the world. And so we want to get the individual parts of this working one step at a time. And so, which goes into the next bullet point. If you are trying to solve a challenge, and let's say you need 6 or 7 lines of code to solve it, you should not be writing 6 or 7 lines of code before you hit the run button, right? Like every time you do something, you change something, you should hit the run button, right? It doesn't cost me a nickel every time I hit this button, right? So I write some code, I run it. I write some code, I run it. I see what I'm getting. I use the console.log to push the things that I'm calculating over to my console to make sure that I'm getting what I'm expecting to get. And then once I'm done with it, I can remove the console, leave my code there, and move on to the next part of my problem. But I should always be running my code over and over and over again as I move through these problems. All right. So debugging, a very important skill, read and understand the traceback errors. We talked about this yesterday, right? So if I delete this, or if I add something in here, like I should throw an error, right? So it's saying on JS 77, right? So on line 77, invalid left-hand side to assignment, which is telling me that basically like it's seeing this equal and it's expecting something else to be assigned to it, but it's not expecting to see a string on the left side of the equal. It should just see this, and there's already one over here. So this is my problem, but this is telling me, hey, this is wrong. And a lot of times the thing that gets highlighted is right before the issue. And then it's going to tell me exactly what line to look at. And so I know to come down here, this is what I need to get rid of, right? And same thing, like if I delete a quote here, I'll get a different type of error, right? Invalid or unexpected token. It's highlighting this entire thing, and it's basically what it highlighted right before the actual problem, everything right before the actual problem. And then so my actual problem's right here, invalid or unexpected token. And that invalid or unexpected token is basically the let down here is unexpected because it's still expecting a quote to keep going, or my string to keep going, right? So I replace that, hit run, right? Everything's right in the world again. So always get comfortable looking at the errors. You run something, you get an error over here, use the line number. If you get a error message that you don't understand, right? So let me do this again. Right, so we'll say JS. Right, the JavaScript unexpected token occur when a specific language construct was expected, but something else was provided. This might be a simple typo, right? And so what went wrong, specific language, well, we already went over that. So uncaught syntax error, expected expression got semicolon. And let's see here, where did they screw up, right? Because they put this comma here. And so that screwed it up. And so this is all stuff that's trying to help you out. See, so everything's correct down here. They pull the comma out. And this is why I like MDM is it's going to give you some different explanations or examples of what's going on here. Right. But don't hesitate to look up your error codes if you run into them. There's a lot of information provided in these while you're writing code. All right, and Google. Yep. So especially for anyone coming out of a pure academic sense, right? There's no like going to Google and looking up the answer is not cheating in coding, right? Unless you're taking a test where, well, and also I'll tell you, like at Code Platoon, all of the assessments are open resource. The only so I think there's 5 or 6 assessments you have to pass over the 15 weeks at Code Platoon. Some of them are like 3 hour, like you get 3 hours to solve a challenge. Some of them like you have the entire weekend. And the only way you can cheat is if you're asking other students for their answer, right? Like you can Google it, you can use any resources you can think of to find the answer, as long as you're not going out there and just scraping the exact answer from another student. All right, so getting comfortable with Google, getting used to asking Google questions and like, so learning the language of programming, right? So like syntax errors and that what a string is and what a number is, what an array is, what an object is, key value pairs, index values, all of those things, right? Like you have to know what to ask Google. Right. So like, and with some of it, there's some flexibility, right? Like, so I could say, I could ask Google, how do I get the index value out of something in an array, and it would give me an answer. Or I could say like, how do I get the index of an element inside of an array? And like that would also get me another answer that I'd be looking for the same question, just phrased differently. But sometimes, especially while you're learning, you'll ask a question and like you'll blow the doors off Google. Like Google has no idea what you're talking about. That is when I strongly recommend that you refer back to Intro to Coding, or if you've got anyone else that's helping you, and say, hey, look, I tried to Google this, but I don't think I'm asking it the right question. And you can even get help in here on how to phrase your questions correctly. All right. So, and that's all part of the learning process here. And the only other thing I would say is there is a pretty good how to think like a Roman emperor. Okay, how to think like a programmer. All right. Your library, like either physical library or like if you have a library that uses Libby, you should be able to get a digital copy of this. This is a really good book. It's been around for a while. There's not a ton of code in here. There is code in here, but a lot of this is like it proxies code with riddles and thinking exercises so that you can start to think about how to solve problems programmatically, right? Like we talked about this, like the difference between like if I was just to describe going out into my kitchen and making a cup of tea versus like how I would have to program all of the steps into a computer, right? So this is a really good primer on how to start thinking about all of those different steps, right? And so like problem, completing a Sudoku square, or and the other one was a really famous the fox, the goose, and the corn, which is a really good riddle if no one's ran across that before. That's a fun one, and it's like, how do you think about solving that programmatically? So again, before you ever go out and spend money, highly recommend that you try and get books for free at the library. Or if you are going to spend money, if you've never heard of it before, I'm a big fan of Humble Bundle. You can also get other stuff on there, but they always have packages of different books that are they're always going to be digital, right? So you get like the PDF or the Mobi copies of it, and they do have no starch press on here every once in a while where you can get that book in a bundle, right? But I mean, like Amazon's charging you $20 for the book, right? Or $21 for to have it on Kindle. But like usually you can come in here, right? So like 18 bucks for 16 books on basically this is all like user interface stuff, right? And I'm thinking about picking this one up because I want to get this TypeScript in 50 lessons, right? And like, so if I type this in here, so type script in 50 lessons, right? So on Kindle, they want $10 for it. They only have it on Kindle, it looks like. Maybe there's somewhere in here that they have it at the paperback edition. But basically, I can get one book for $10, or I can get all 16 of these books for 18. Right. And so Humble Bundle's great. If you've never been on the site before, they're legit. I've bought tons of bundles. They have O'Reilly on here all the time, packed. Right, so like they've got an O'Reilly cybersecurity one right now, so 16 items for 25 bucks. That's usually for the books, that's about as expensive as they get. And if you don't need all the books, like you can pare it down. Yeah, the bundles are pre-selected, and they rotate through. They all have expiration dates. Right, so like the 14 days, 2 days left, 4 days left, right? And like there's always new ones popping up on here. And like I said, I mean, I'm not like I don't get kickbacks from Humble Bundle unless they watch this YouTube video somewhere down the line. But I mean, like I've bought tons of bundles on here, right? Like I mean, I get reimbursed for my company or for all the programming books that I want and stuff like that. And so like I buy tons of bundles on here. I check in on the site probably once a week to see if there's anything that I want, right? And like that this one looks pretty good. I haven't seen them offer this one before. So like I might grab this one. Like we've got data visualization. They also do like software packages through Mammoth, if you've heard of that website, right? So like full stack development, and Excel, Python, machine learning, like game assets, stuff like that. So there's all sorts of stuff on this website. It's worth checking out once in a while. And when I first found it, I was like, this can't be right. Like this is a scam. They just want to steal my credit card number, but it's legit. It's been around for, I don't know, like 10, 12 years or whatever. A portion of all the proceeds go to a pre-selected charity. Each bundle is a different charity. And it's all digital. So like I said, you're not buying paperbacks or anything like that. But if you're cool using PDFs, or like I said, if you've got a Kindle, it's a good way to get a build up a library pretty cheap. All right, so that is it for the problem solving. Session 2. So like I said, this one is the intro to the replet, which we've already covered all of these. We've got formatting and clean code. So proper formatting of your code. If you remember anything, just be consistent. We talked about this yesterday. Basically, like if you use double quotes, try and use double quotes every time. If you use single quotes, use single quotes every time. Try not to have a bunch of extra spaces like hanging out, right? Like this, like if someone turned this code into me, like I'd say like, hey, go back and delete this line of code, like clean this up. That your spacing is correct. So a lot of this, right? So if I say let object 2 equal this, and so I do my curly braces and it opens up when I hit enter, it's automatically pushing me to that next line, right? So it's already tabbing me in, it's already indenting it for me. And technically I can write it like this. And this works, right? Like this will still run, but this is harder to read, right? Like if I take everything and slam it up against the left side, like this becomes a lot harder to read. And so we use the tab key. This is 2 spaces as a tab in JavaScript, and it doesn't stop the code from running, right? So like if I do something like this and I hit run, everything's still going to run. It just makes it harder to read. Now, in certain languages, like Python being one of them, if you do not have your tabs lined up correctly, Python will throw an error and it will not execute your code. And especially if you plan on attending Code Platoon, or if you're going to be learning Python down the road, just get in the habit of writing clean code now. So proper variable names, descriptive naming. The name of a variable should make it clear what the data represents. Use camel case with naming variables. We use camel case for everything in JavaScript, and proper indentation and spacing. All right, so with variable names, I'll just give you a quick example here, right? So like I can say, let's create a function. We'll call a function add 2 numbers. And we'll call it num1 and num2. right? And so I'm going to return num1 and num2, and let's go ahead and console.log our function call here, right? So if I do something like this, and I put in a string here, and I put ham and cheese in here, and if you're reviewing my code and I run this, this is going to work, right? It's going to add the string together, just like it would two numbers. When you add a string together, it just basically adds them into the same line. But if I were reading this, I'd be like, you know, Charles, this is num1, num2. The function's called add two numbers. We should probably be giving this numbers, right? And now if I were writing TypeScript where I have to declare the type, right? Like I would then basically be like num1 number and num2 number. And if I didn't give them numbers, this would scream at me and tell me that I'm creating an error because I'm trying to give the invalid type into this function, right? But in JavaScript, and this is what we mean when we call it a dynamic language, the variables can be anything and they can be reassigned to anything, right? So I can take a number, right? So, and I could say let my number equal 7, and then I can say my number is equal to cheddar, and console.log my number, and I see cheddar, right? And nothing stopped me from changing a variable called my number into the string cheddar. And in other languages, so Java, C#, TypeScript, which is a extension of JavaScript, a strongly typed version of JavaScript, there are things built into the language to stop you from doing that. But in Python, in Ruby, in JavaScript, and I'm sure some other languages out there that are dynamic languages, when you declare a variable, they set aside space for memory for that to be a large number, an integer, a floating point integer, an array, an object, or a string, right? And so in certain languages where maybe you are just like in Java, if you do char, that is a string that can only be one character long. So when you declare that char, it will only set aside, I think, like 1 or 2 bytes of memory for it. I don't remember the exact amount. But if you do a string, it will set aside like 8 bytes of memory, right? And so if we're writing something that is where speed is of an absolute necessity, we would pick something like Java where we can pare down the memory usage and control what we're doing by the way that we declare our variables. And in JavaScript, we have no way to do that, right? Like every time we declare it, I don't remember the exact amount, but I think like every time we declare a variable in JavaScript, like it sets aside like 32 bits of memory or something like that, or 32 bytes of memory. And that doesn't sound like much, but again, like I've been working on software now that's been in production for like 3 or 4 years. We have millions of lines of code with hundreds of thousands of variables in it, right? And so now it starts to add up, right? And so now if you're like a company like Facebook or Google, where you have like this massive code base, that's when it starts to make a difference. And as it gets bigger and bigger, it can make the language harder to scale. All right. And so that is pretty much it for all of the slides. All right. It is 7:15. Does anyone have any questions for me about anything we covered in session 1 or session 2 so far? Going once, going twice? Okay, so I am going to pause the recording. All right, everyone, 7:26 p.m. Central Time, Wednesday, October 11th, Intro to Coding Live Session 2 for JavaScript. We're about to get into our first challenges. All right, For anyone with any type of previous coding experience, even if you've just like done a couple of challenges, these first handful of challenges will be pretty elementary. But like I said, they do start to ramp up in difficulty as we go. All right, so let me see if I make this bigger. Okay, so with all the challenges here, they basically go from easiest to hardest. Like as you go down the list, they get progressively harder. Employee data is, with the exception of recursion, which we have not talked about that yet. We'll get to that. I believe session 7 or session 8, we talk about recursion. But employee data is by far and away the hardest problem on here. This is one that you want to, basically, if you can answer this one, this is where the easy ones are on the application. Like the first 2 or 3 problems on the Code Platoon application are right here at about the employee data level. All right, so, and then the Code Platoon application does the same thing where they get progressively harder. And again, they'll talk about this, like they don't release the exact amount of points that you need to get in, but you can score partial points on these, and very few people, if any, ever score more than a handful of points on like the last couple of challenges on there. You definitely can push yourself and do it, but you don't need to get 100% to get in. And again, I don't know what percent you need. I don't grade the applications. You can try and pry it out of Guillermo, but no class before you has been successful yet. But just know that like those first handful of like those first 2 or 3, you should definitely be getting 10 out of 10 on, if you want a decent shot. And then like the next 3 or 4, like you should be getting at least like 8 out of 10 on, 7 out of 10. And then like on the back half of the test, like you want to be getting at least some points on them. And he'll go more into that. All right, so up here, and everyone should have this list, right? Like I send it out in the welcome email. I've dropped the link in the chat. I'll drop it in the chat again here right now. Sorry. Um, 1023. Share, copy link. Right, so here it is again. So everyone has access to it. You can download this, you can save it on your computer, you can remember the link, right? Everyone has access to this, so you can get in here. What you're going to do, and you should have set up your Replit account by now, is you will click on this, and you are looking at CP admin's copy of this test or of this challenge. All right, and so you can look at it, you can look at the files, like the setup for it, but you cannot edit anything on this. You can see this has been copied 2,700 times now, give or take, right? And so, oops, didn't want to do that. So basically, like you're limited in what you can do over here. You need to fork it, and you can change the name if you want to. I recommend you just hit the fork REPL button down here, right? And then if it's the first time you forked it, it'll save a copy of it. And then if it's you've forked it before, like it'll have a number next to it. All right, so inside each of these is the index.js, which is where we're going to be writing our code. All right, and then there's a README that gives you a brief description of what's going on here. All right, so write a function that takes your first name and last name as arguments and returns your first and last name as a single string. All right, so we've already covered a couple of different ways to solve this class. At the top of every file here is a block of notes called prep. right? So parameters, return, example, and pseudocode. You can copy this block, you can use it on other challenges that you're doing on other websites, other classes, anything like that. I highly recommend that while you're learning, you get comfortable using prep, right? And that will help you set out a template as how we're going to solve this. And it seems a little sparse because these challenges are so light. But this will, if you get used to doing this every time and you start getting the more difficult challenges, this is going to help you out significantly. Okay, so we have two parameters, right? So I have two params. Both are strings representing first and last names. All right, and return, I'm going to have one return. So I need to return one string that is the combination of first plus last properly formatted. All right, an example for these, I just say see below, right? Because we've got 3 tests written here. And so let's take a look. And a couple of these don't have tests written for them. And this is not how you would actually write tests for when you're writing code. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like on the last night. But what we're doing is we're taking our function call and we're giving it our 2 parameters, our string for our first name, our string for our last name. And we're saying, is this strictly equal to this string? Because this is how we want to see this formatted, right? And so what I would do here, and we'll take this step by step. And so the pseudocode for this is I need to concat the 2 strings, need to make sure that it is properly formatted, which means adding a space. All right. And so right now, if I hit return and I just do first name plus last name, right, and I hit run, I get false. And I'm not sure why. So let's go ahead and we'll take this and we're going to move this into a console.log. So let's see what first name plus last name looks like over here in the console. All right, so I've got Michael Jordan, there's no space in there. Tom Preet, Ada Lovelace, right? And that's where I'm getting my falses down here. So what I need to do is something like this, right? I need that space in there in between the names. Right, so that looks better, like that looks like what I want. I'm still getting false because I haven't made the change down here yet. I've only done it in my console.log. Right, so let's do this. True, true, true. All right. First challenge in the books. All right, that's all there was to it. Now, what I will throw out to anyone in the class that wants to take a stab at this, is there a different way that I could accomplish this same solution?
Yes, using the backticks.
Yep, using the backtick, so using the string literal. Right, so if I was given this problem, this is a perfectly good solution, but the way I would personally tackle it, so I don't have to add in, like, use the addition symbols and add in a space, is I would probably wrap this whole thing in backticks and then do something like this. Right, and by doing it this way, I can write it like more like I would naturally write. And so now if I run it, I still get all my truths. So I'm still getting the same thing over here. I got rid of the console.log, but I know that this is what I'm outputting because these tests are returning true. So again, we do our prep work. We make sure that we read the instructions. We get it working. We hit the run button a lot to try and figure out what's going on. We use the console.log to output to the console to visually inspect what we've got going on here. And we work step by step towards getting to that solution. All right, so we don't just come down and write the line of code and dust our hands off and move to the next one because we're not necessarily learning what we need to at that point. All right, and it can feel like we want to do that with the first ones because maybe they're easy. Like I said, get in the habit of doing your prep work and doing this step by step and hitting that run button as we move through these. And again, at the end of the night, I will take a link to this and I will post this in the intro to coding chat so everyone will have access to all of the solutions that I'm creating here. Okay, so that was the first challenge. The next challenge is total change due. All right, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come in, we're going to click on it, we're going to fork it. We're going to look at the README and we're going to say write a function that takes in the amount paid and the total cost as integers and returns the amount due and change. All right, so let me grab this. Let me just throw this over here. Oops. Pizza when I should have French fried. All right, there we go. All right, so I am going to walk through the prep again. And I will then take the prep and copy and paste it into the intro to coding in the Slack chat. And then I'm going to break everyone out probably into groups of 3 for this one. And we'll go over rules of the breakout room and what's going on with that. And I'll probably give everyone like 15 minutes to try and solve this one. And then we'll go from there. Right, and then this is kind of be what class is going to be like for the next 8 sessions. I do a challenge, and then we select another challenge. We kind of go over the intro together. I give you some time to solve it as a team, and then we come back and go over it as a group. All right. So I have once again 2 params. Both are numbers representing amount paid and cost, total cost. All right, and I'm going to return one param, which is also a number that represents the change due. So, all right, so amount paid less total cost. All right, examples see below. All right, so I will warn you, there is a twist in this one that you're going to run into. All right, and so I need to subtract the total cost from the amount paid to get the change due. All right, so if I look down here, I've got an integer and an integer, but when I look at the second one, I've got an integer and a floating point. Right, so that tells me that I'm going to be dealing with floating point numbers here, so decimals. All right, so let me go ahead and drop this into the chat so everyone has access to it. And let me create the breakout rooms here. So I'm going to pause the recording. All right, everyone, welcome back from the Total Change Due challenge. It is 8:02 p.m. Central Time. We're going to go ahead and go over the answer as a class. It looks like a couple of the groups solved it. So let's go ahead and get started. So we've already done the prep work on this, right? We've got 2 incoming numbers, and we need to return one number that is the change due. So basically the amount paid less the total cost. So let's go ahead and we'll throw a return in here. And let's do amount paid less the total cost, right? So this is what I need for my total change due. So we go ahead and run this. I get one true. So it looked like we handled the one with integers okay, and we got one false. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab this, and let's go ahead and throw it up in a console.log to see what we've got going on here. All right, and so when I run this, okay, so I get 25, which is what I would expect, and then I get 2.719999998. All right, and JavaScript doesn't like decimal points. A lot of software languages don't. And that is because they use a different mathematical system, right? So JS floating point precision. All right, JavaScript numbers are always 64-bit floating point. Normally stored as double precision floating point numbers following the international 754 standard. All right, and so JS let's see what we got here. So all these different reasons as to why or how to deal with it. And it's basically that there are it doesn't use like the base 10. I think it uses like base 12 or something like that as the mathematical system. I will find an article that goes into exactly why, and I will post it as a link inside of the challenge. But let's go ahead and take a look at how we would solve this. All right, so I'd say how to limit decimal places in JS. And let's see what we get. To limit the number of digits up to 2 places after the decimal, the toFix method is used. The fix method or toFix method rounds up the floating point number to 2 places. So let's go ahead and see what toFix does for us. Right, and so I could take something like this and we'll wrap the whole thing here, and we'll do toFix, and we'll give it 2 decimal places. All right, so now I've got 25.00, and I'm still getting true here, and I'm getting 2.72, but I'm getting false still. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into toFix over here in MDN. All right, so number, and let's see here in alphabetical order. toFixed. All right, toFixed method of a number values formats the number using fixed point notation. Sorry, one second. Let me close the door. I've got a cat yelling in the hallway. All right, and so digits, the number of digits to appear after the decimal point should be a value between 0 and 100 inclusive. If the argument is omitted, it is treated as 0. And so what that means is that you don't have to put a number in here, but it has to be a number between 0 and 100, and that will control how many decimal places there are. And now we get into the nitty-gritty here, the return value. A string representing the given number using fixed point notation. All right, and I do apologize. I still had one true and one false up here, and that's because I didn't change it in my return. I just changed it in the console.log. But when I do toFixed up here, what I should see is actually both of these go to false, right? False and false. And because now I'm doing strictly equal, and again, according to this, my return value is a string representing the given number, right? And because I'm doing strictly equal, I'm now doing string representations of the number, right? And so that's why I'm getting a false there. So now I've solved one step, right? Like I've learned how to control my decimal places. So now I hit run. I'm working through it. So what's the next thing I need to do, right? So how do I convert a string to a number in JS. Right? So 7 ways to convert a string into a number in JavaScript. So parse int, number, using the unary operator, so just a plus symbol, parse float, math.floor, multiply with numbers. So there's lots of different ways in here. Now, I know if I do parse int, right? So that's the one at the top of the list. So if I check this out and I look at, actually, let me look it up here in MDN. Right? So there's parse int, number.parse int. Right, so number.parseInt x base. I don't need the base in there. I can just use parseInt. And so, but this is telling me the number parseInt static method parses a string argument and returns the integer of the specified radix or base. All right, so if I take this whole thing and wrap it in parseInt. All right, I'm back to true and false. And the reason for that is basically when I run this, I see I'm at 25 and 2. Sorry, console.log, amount paid. Let's do this, that. Right, so I'm at 25 and 2. So the parse int is converting my floating point into an integer. So what else was there on that list? So I see parse float, right? So let's go ahead and check that out, right? Parse float, static method parses an argument and returns a floating point number. If a number cannot be parsed from the argument, it returns nan, which means not a number. All right, so let's go ahead and give that one a try. So we'll change our parse int into a parse float. All right, 25, true, 2.72, true. So notice how these turn from white, the 25 and the 2.72, it turned from string representations to the actual number, right? And now I'm getting true for both of them. So that is how I would solve this. I don't need this console.log anymore, right? I'll leave it in there just for the notes, but now I'm at true and true, all right? Does anyone have any questions on how I walk through this step by step?
So there was a girl in my group that she solved it by putting like a mathematical equation on there.
Yep, that'll work too. I think there was down here, it was the unary operator, right? So I can actually, without doing the parse float, I think I can just put a plus symbol here, right? And I get true and true, because that plus symbol is forcing those string representations of numbers back into numbers, right? But not everyone has seen this, or maybe you don't know this trick, so this could be confusing. But parse float is very explicit, and it is telling me this function is parsing a float, right? And so I would recommend using something that explicitly tells a story in your code, because it makes it easier for the next person to come along and understand what's going on, right? Like, but we could take a look here. We can grab this. And we'll say, right, we'll throw that in there. And I'll also, like I said, I'll find the article on how JS treats decimal places and why it does it that way. And I'll throw a link into that as well. So that'll be in there when you come back to look at it. Right. And with a lot of these challenges, there are going to be multiple ways to solve these. Usually the way that I'm trying to solve it is in a way that tells a story and that makes it easy to read the code later when you come back. Because I mean, all of this is fresh right now. You may be not nodding your head, but when you are like, if you come back to this a week from now, it may be a little bit fuzzy again, right? And so we want to make the code as easy and as explicit as possible when someone else comes in to read it, right? There's a saying in software development, when you're writing code, write code that is nice to other people, but also write code that is nice to your future self. Like I said, I've been on the same project for about 3.5 years now. And I see my code that I wrote 3.5 years ago as a brand new developer. And sometimes I just have to facepalm myself and like look at it and just be like, wow, like, yep, that's what I did as a new person. Let's go ahead and clean that up. Right. And there's another developer saying that says, don't judge like how poorly the code is written because you may have been the one who actually wrote it. And that is also very true too. When you get into actually writing code and even when you go to Code Platoon, everything's going to be managed by GitHub. And if you haven't heard of Git before, if you want to become a software developer, you're going to have to learn Git on top of programming languages. It's basically a version control language. GitHub, Gitbucket, there's a couple other sites out there. GitHub is the biggest one. AWS Code Commit. And so every time you write code and you save it to your project, you can go back and look at that as long as you don't delete the entire project. So I can go back and on my software and look at code that someone wrote 5 or 6 years ago, even though the code doesn't exist in the current version of the software. I can flip back through previous saves. And when you hold your mouse over it, like if I were to do something like this, and this was in a Git repository, it would tell me the name of the person who wrote that line of code and how long ago they wrote it. And I can't tell you how many times I've looked at a bad line of code, held my mouse over it, and it's my name stamped on it from a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Replit does save your work, but it is your individual work. Like you're the only one on this Replit. You can invite other people. GitHub can save like an unlimited amount of developers over an unlimited amount of time on a project. So I can look at developers that don't even work for the company anymore, code that they wrote 5-6 years ago and it was first getting built like in the first couple of years of the project. If this software is around 20 years from now, someone's going to be able to flip back far enough and see that I wrote code in there, even if it's not actively being used anymore, right? So within software management, like it's just like the rest of the internet, like nothing ever truly goes away. Like you can find it somewhere. All right. So any other, and Pia, I see your solution as well. Also another perfectly good way of handling it. So multiplying it by 100 and then dividing it by 100. So you get rid of forcing it to even deal with decimals, because at that point, like you're basically doing 1,000 minus 728, you get 272. And it handles the decimal points better when you do the division instead of the subtraction. All right, so any other questions on this one? All right, let's go ahead and pick out the next one here. Okay, so convert to hours. This is another good one. So I'm going to walk through the prep and kind of talk about how to handle it. And then I'm going to push everyone back out into their breakout groups again. Or into new breakout groups. I'll try and shuffle them up each time. All right, so remember, we click on it in the list, right? So we're doing convert to hours. And then we're going to get into the CP admin version. At the top right, we're going to click fork on the Replit. And we'll end up with our own copy. So let's take a look at the README. So write a function that takes in a number of minutes and returns the hour equivalent as a float integer. All right, so Let's go ahead and do that here. And we'll take these. This. All right, so a couple of things here. Again, if you are on a PC, I believe it's the control key that you'll use. If you're on a Mac like myself, you use the command key. A couple of shortcuts I just used there. All right, so let me undo this here real quick. All right, so a couple of different things. We talked about making comments, right? So you can either put 2 forward slashes and it'll comment on a line of code, or you can hit the command / or control / right? And it does it automatically. You can comment in and out, and you can highlight multiple lines at a time and do them like comment them in and out. And then also, what's different from a word processor, right? So like if you took like a text editor or Microsoft Word and you highlighted text and you put a character in there, it would replace the highlighted text with whatever character you just typed. If you do a bracketing character, so if you do this or this or this or this or this, notice how you get, when you do one, I'm getting both of them automatically. Like when I do my opening bracket, I automatically get my closing one. Same for all of these. So if you highlight text in the editor and you use one of these bracket, parens, curly braces, or quotes, so I'll use some parens, it does not replace it. It's smart enough to know that you want to wrap what you just highlighted in that, right? And so then I can just do console.log. And I don't have to tab back and forth and do my starting one and then add my closing one. It'll do them both at the same time. Now, another thing I just did here is if you take and highlight text, and notice how I'm highlighting, right? It's highlighting identical text elsewhere in the file, right? So I can take this and I've got 2 hours, 2 hours, 2 hours, right? And I don't want this one up here. It's going to start where I highlight. And if you hit, again, on a PC, Control D, like Delta, or Command D on a Mac, that is multi-line typing, right? So I hit Command D, and notice how I've got 2 lines. I hit Command D again, and I've got 3 lines, right? So I can hit the Home key. I do my opening, I do my closing. Whoops, let's do this better. We'll do highlight the whole thing, opening and closing. I come back, hit the Home key, console.log, right? And now, instead of having to do that 3 individual times, it did it all at once for me, right? And so that's just same thing here. Like these fat arrows don't actually belong. I need triple equals, so I'll highlight all 3 of these, and there's my triple equals. All right, so hit run. Up, 2. All right, so that's that. And so that will, it takes a little while getting used to that. And the big thing is make sure once you're done with your multi-highlight, that you hit the escape key to get away from it, because it's very easy. Like you get this and then I go somewhere else and I start typing, and next thing you know, now I'm typing on 3 different lines. So escape key exits the multi-select. All right. So for params, I get 1 param, a number that represents minutes, and I'm going to return 1 number possibly an int or a floating point, or we'll just call it a float, that represents the number of hours. All right. Example, we'll say C below. All right, so here's this. Let me grab this. I'm going to copy this into the chat here. Give everyone a second to grab it. And then any questions for me before I send everyone back out into the breakout rooms? Minutes here. All right, welcome back from the Convert Hours to Minutes challenge. All right, so we are going to take a look at this step by step. We already went through the prep. And so let's go ahead and console.log minutes just to make sure that we're getting what we expect in here. All right, so 45, 75, 125. The falses I'm not worried about right now because I'm not returning anything. So if I have a function where I don't return anything, this is resolving to undefined. So undefined will always be false against these. All right, now the number of minutes, and it's just saying convert this to hours using basically like, and we can return decimal points, right? We can have floating point numbers in here. So I can do something like this where I get 0.75, 1.25. So like those look good. But again, we run into the precision stuff here. And there isn't additional ones. But basically what we're looking at is this would be very similar to the total change due. It's just that we're going to need to take our two fixed out to a further decimal place, right? And so if I take this entire thing and I wrap it and I say two fixed, and because this one is 0.083, I'm going to give this a 3, right? And I've got 0.750, 1.250, 2.083. But again, these have turned to white, so they're not numbers anymore. They're strings. They're string representations of numbers. And so remember, there's multiple different ways to get this done, but I would like to do this in the most explicit way possible. So I'm going to wrap this and I'm going to say parse float. All right, let's run this. So 0.75, 1.25. Notice how I'm chopping off those trailing zeros automatically. Those don't get printed out when we're dealing with the number like you would with the string. And so we've got that. So these, I believe, are going to be the right answers, but we're still getting false because, again, no return. We're just console.logging it, right? So if I want to keep console.logging it, I can leave that there. I'll take this, I'll get rid of this, and I'll turn this into a return. And let's go ahead and run it one more time. And I get true, true, and true. I'll leave this in for future reference in the notes, but I'm going to comment it out. There's my 3 truths. Anyone have any questions about how I walk through the solution on this one?
Can you tell me again what you did so that it didn't say 0.750? Somehow I missed that.
That's the parse float, right? So if I get rid of this parse float right here, I'll do it here as 1 second. Let me do this the right way. We'll uncomment this. And so if I get rid of this parse float, and I run this, again, this is in white, so this is telling me these are strings, right? And in a string, you'll get leading zeros, trailing zeros, the whole works, right? Because it's just a string. So that can hold any type of character in there. However, when I do a parse float, it will get rid of any trailing zeros because they're not needed, right? Because 0.750 is the exact same thing as 0.75, right? And so here it is in the two fixed, right? So the same thing, like if I change this to two fixed 10, right? Well, actually, whoops, I did it in the wrong spot. Two fixed 10. Right, so I get all of those trailing zeros in there because two fixed is going to take it out to that many decimal places, regardless of what's going on, whether it needs to or not, because that's what two fixed does. However, again, so if I take this whole thing and I wrap it in that parse float, convert it back to a number, the number doesn't care about those trailing zeros, so it chops them off. Now I'm getting the trailing repeating decimal, which I don't want either, so I want to change this back to a 3. Right, and I'm back to passing all 3 of my tests here. All right, so that is it for the challenges for the evening. If anyone else has got any other questions for me, it's 8:56. We've still got 3 or 4 minutes of class left. I'm happy to answer anything else you've got. As I said before, a link to all of my solutions will be posted in Slack along with a copy of the video and the notes that we took at the beginning of class. It does take a couple hours for YouTube to parse the video, so I'll post the link. If you try and click on it tonight, it'll probably tell you that the video doesn't exist, but by tomorrow morning, you'll be able to click on it. Any other questions for me?
Would you be able to show us an example how we could save these individual challenges onto our own Replit page?
Yes, so you are saving them when you go. So if you've created a Replit account, you're signed into your Replit account. When you come in here and you click on one of these challenges and you hit the fork, this is saved. So a fork is making your own personal copy of it, right? So if you've been following along and you've been forking these challenges, so like if I come back to Replit, right? So this is my account. See, it's owned by Charles Kubiak. I've got convert hours. There's my notes. There's my total change due. There's first name, last name. Right. And so like, and then like, these are the ones from the class that I taught a month ago. All right. So when you go back to your homepage on Replit, so like if once you've cloned one of the Replits, if you go, I think just up here and then click on home, you will see all of your recent Replits, and then you can click on the folder and you can see all of the Replits you've ever created.
Okay, I see it now. Okay. Thank you.
Yep, no worries. Any other questions? All right, let me check the chat here real quick. All right, so let me pause the recording